good evening, and welcome. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, what city are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? I like collecting those locations because they remind me this is being heard in many different rooms, in many different nights. Tonight's episode is a calm, historical documentary. Not a dramatic story, but a slow look at ordinary medieval winter life, especially what happened around bedtime. We'll move step by step from how night began to how sleep was organized, to what beds were made from, how houses held heat, and why waking in the middle of the night was often normal rather than alarming. The goal is not to romanticize the past, and not to make it miserable either, just to describe how people adapted, using the materials and ideas they had. As we go, you'll notice a pattern. Medieval winter wasn't defined by one single hardship, but by many small constraints happening at once. Darkness, fuel, smoke, damp, limited privacy, and the constant need to conserve resources. And yet, inside those constraints, people built routines that could still feel familiar. Evening food, quiet conversation, preparation for morning, and the steady communities. Sunset functioned like a boundary. Without electric lighting, darkness changed what was safe and what was practical. Paths and fields became hard to navigate. Even familiar yards could feel uncertain once the sky went fully black. Indoors, light existed, but it was expensive or inconvenient. Many households relied mainly on the hearth, a shifting orange glow that lit faces and left corners in deep shadow. Candles were not a casual habit. Beeswax candles burned cleanly and brightly, but beeswax was valuable and often reserved for churches or wealthier homes. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, were more common, but they could smoke, smell strong, and burn unevenly. Oil lamps existed in some regions, but oil supply varied by season and local economy. Because light and fuel were both resources, evening activity tended to compress. The last meal often came earlier than a modern dinner. Tools were put away while there was still enough visibility to do it safely. Animals were checked and brought closer. Doors were latched or barred. People did not drift toward bed out of laziness. They did it because night reduced options, and because tomorrow's labor still demanded strength. Winter intensified this logic. Longer darkness, colder air, and higher stakes medieval for every choice. It helps to avoid assuming a modern 8-hour block as the universal standard. In winter, especially, many people seem to have practiced a pattern of 2 sleeps. An early, heavy sleep soon after night settled in, then a calm interval of wakefulness, and then a second sleep that carried them toward dawn. This pattern appears in a range of historical references, household accounts, literature, and later observations, though it was not identical in every region or every century, and it wasn't followed perfectly by everyone. But it makes practical sense in a world shaped by natural light. When a winter night can last 14 or 15 hours, there is simply more time to fill, and the human body does not always treat that entire stretch as one continuous sleep. The first sleep often came quickly, especially after physical work and limited evening stimulation. Then, after several hours, waking could occur without panic. Not an emergency, not insomnia as a personal failure, but an expected phase in the night. That waking interval could be used for small tasks, prayer, checking safety, or simply resting quietly before returning to bed. In this episode, we'll keep that rhythm in mind because many winter routines, fuel, food, hygiene, even security, in practical terms, the first sleep tended to be the deepest. After a day of hauling water, feeding animals, repairing tools, walking through cold air, or doing indoor labor by dim light, bodies dropped into rest with little ceremony. The household would settle while the hearth dimmed, voices lowered, movement slowed. In one-room homes, several people might already be lying down close together because closeness created warmth. Then, later in the night, a quiet waking could arrive. Someone might open their eyes and notice the fire had fallen to embers. The room might feel colder, the air slightly damp, the silence more complete. This was the moment when medieval households sometimes did very small, practical things. Shifting a blanket around a child, checking that a door latch was still secure, deciding whether to add a little fuel or to conserve it until morning. In homes where relighting a fire was difficult, keeping embers alive mattered. Waking could also be bodily. The need to use a chamber pot kept near the sleeping area, or in some rural settings, the unpleasant decision to step outside briefly into deep darkness. After a period, sometimes short, sometimes longer, many returned to bed for the second sleep. That later sleep was often lighter, with dreams closer to the surface, and with easier waking as on where it happened, and for many households the bedroom was not a separate room at all. In rural areas, homes were often organized around a single main space, a place to cook, store tools, repair clothing, and, at night, sleep. That meant rest took place near the practical objects of daily survival. Sacks of grain, bundles of kindling, damp outer garments hung to dry, and sometimes the presence or sounds of animals nearby. Privacy, in the modern sense, was limited. Parents, children, and sometimes older relatives shared the same air and the same heat. In winter, that closeness was partly cultural, but it was also physical strategy. Bodies close together reduce heat loss, especially under heavy coverings, and that matters when the room itself cannot be warmed evenly. The sleeping area might be a raised wooden platform, a bench-like structure, or simply a section of floor made more tolerable with straw and layered cloth. A well-made bed could be one of the most valuable items in a household, repaired over years, mentioned in wills, and treated as property worth inheriting. This is an important point for understanding medieval winter nights. Comfort was not only taste or habit, it was an arrangement of scarce materials, chosen because it increased the chance of resting through cold hours without losing too much body heat. Bedding materials were shaped by availability. A common mattress was a sturdy cloth sack, often called a tick, stuffed with straw, chaff, or dried grass. This created a layer between the body and the cold ground, but it was rarely soft. Straw breaks, shifts, and compresses, and over time it becomes flatter and more uncomfortable. In damp houses, it could also hold moisture, which makes cold feel sharper. Some communities used dried leaves when conditions allowed. In certain regions, beech leaves were sometimes considered relatively comfortable for a while, though collecting and drying enough leaves was labor in itself. Wool stuffing was warmer and more resilient, but wool was valuable and usually needed for clothing and blankets, so it was less likely to be used inside a mattress unless a family had extra resources. Another practical issue was the floor. Packed earth, clay, and stone all draw heat away. Even a small elevation mattered, so people used boards, simple frames, or extra layers of straw beneath the sleeping surface. None of this created luxury. It created insulation, just enough to make rest possible. Alongside warmth came drawbacks that were hard to avoid. Dust, mites, and insects that could persist through winter because washing and drying bedding required time, fuel, and weather that did not, or, in many settings, a form of wealth. Producing textiles took sustained work. Raising animals, processing fiber, spinning, weaving, and then maintaining cloth through constant mending. Wool was especially valuable in winter because it insulates even when slightly damp, a major advantage in rooms where breath, smoke, and weather could keep the air moist. Linen existed, but it was also labor-intensive, made from flax that had to be grown and processed through multiple stages before it became thread and cloth. As a result, linen sheets were not universal. Many people slept directly on rougher fabric or on the mattress cover itself, adding layers where they could. Cloaks, patched garments, and spare cloth used more for function than appearance. Night head coverings were practical rather than decorative. A simple cap reduced heat loss and kept soot and oils from transferring to bedding in smoky interiors. The goal of the bed was not elegance. It was basic engineering, reducing drafts, trapping a pocket of warmer air around the body, and making the long dark hours less draining. When we imagine medieval winter sleep, it helps to think less about the modern idea of a cozy bedroom and more about a controlled microenvironment assembled from whatever a household could afford. And among skilled trades or more prosperous families, beds could be more structured. Wooden frames might be strung with rope supports, creating a flexible base that held a mattress above the floor. Those ropes stretched over time, so tightening them was routine maintenance, one of the small domestic jobs that kept nights from becoming physically miserable. Mattresses could be better too. Improved cloth, more resilient stuffing, sometimes will mixed in for warmth and softness. Feather bedding, when present, signaled real comfort and usually accumulated slowly. Beds also carried social meaning. A carved headboard, painted wood, or a canopy could mark status as much as utility. But even in better homes, winter remained a problem to manage rather than a condition to ignore. Townhouses could be drafty, and stone walls, common in many urban settings, hold cold for long periods. So people used room strategy, hanging cloth near doors, placing rugs or rushes on the floor, blocking gaps, and positioning beds away from exterior walls when possible. Warmth was not just what you owned. It was how you placed and layered what you had. And the bed itself, whether simple or elaborate, stayed connected to the larger household system. Fuel supply, indoor air quality, and the daily schedule of work that began again as soon as the very wealthy, the bed could become a small room within a room. Curtains and canopies were not only decoration. Heavy fabric reduced drafts and trapped warmer air close to the sleeper, while also providing privacy in spaces where servants or guards might be nearby. In buildings with cold masonry, wall hangings served a similar purpose by softening the transfer of cold from stone into the air of the sleeping space. Wealth also made certain comforts possible. Pre-warming the bed, for example, by heating stones near the fire, wrapping them in cloth, and placing them near the feet. Warming pans, metal trays holding embers, could be slid between sheets, though they carried obvious risks. Fire was always a companion to warmth, and medieval homes contained many materials that burned readily. Timber frames, straw thatch, wool textiles, dry rushes on floors. Even in castles, not every room was heated, and corridors could feel as cold as outdoors. So higher status improved the tools of comfort, but it did not eliminate winter. It simply changed the balance. More insulation, more fabric barriers, more labor available to manage heat, alongside the same underlying realities of cold air and limited heated space. This is useful context before we step back from the bed and look at the main engine of night life in winter, the hearth and the practical trade-offs it brought into almost every home. Heating was not a system. It was a fire. The open hearth produced warmth, but it also produced smoke, soot, and constant management decisions. In simpler cottages, the hearth might be a cleared patch of earth edged with stones. In better homes, it could sit in clay or stonework with basic iron supports to hold a pot. Cooking and heating were not separate tasks, which meant the day's food and the night's warmth were closely linked. Smoke behavior depended on architecture. Where chimneys were absent or imperfect, smoke drifted through the room and escaped through roof openings, vents, or gaps in thatch and timber. Over years, interiors could become darkened by soot, and winter air could feel heavy. People adapted by using space as best they could, keeping the sleeping area away from the thickest smoke when possible, arranging work near clearer air, and accepting that fresh air in winter had a cost because it invited cold inside. As chimneys and fireplaces spread in some regions and periods, rooms could become more breathable, but the change was not simple. Chimneys pulled smoke up and out, yet strong drafts could also carry warm air away, and fireplaces often consumed large amounts of fuel for the heat they delivered. So even improvements arrived with trade-offs. At night, households still faced the same basic choice: keep a stronger fire and accept risk, or let it fall to embers and accept colder air. In the background of that choice was another constant winter concern: fuel, how it was gathered, stored, and rationed depended on a strict arithmetic of fuel. Wood was not simply there, waiting to be used. In many regions, forests were controlled by lords, towns, or monasteries, and access could be limited by custom or law. Some households had rights to gather fallen branches, deadwood, or brush, often under rules that could be enforced more harshly in difficult years. Taking living trees without permission could bring punishment. This made fuel planning a real part of winter preparation. Families stored bundles under eaves, stacked them against walls, or kept some indoors to dry. Dry fuel mattered because wet wood gives less heat and more smoke, which increases irritation and wastes effort. Where trees were scarce, people turned to peat, turf, or charcoal. Peat can burn steadily but may smoke heavily and leave a strong odor on clothing and bedding. Charcoal burns cleaner and hotter, but producing it requires extra labor and controlled burning. Fuel could also become a social pressure point. Theft, disputes, and quiet desperation when the pile ran low. In a long winter, the question was not abstract: how many warm nights remain in what you have stored? And because the hearth was tied to cooking as well as warmth, fuel shortage affected meals, work schedules, and sleep. A weaker fire could mean a colder bed, a more restless night, and a harder morning when daylight provide heat. It demanded care. In a house built from timber, thatch, cloth, and dry plant material, sparks were not a minor event. Many households developed practical habits that reduced risk: keeping children away from the hearth, drying clothing at a careful distance, and letting tall flames settle before anyone lay down for long. At bedtime, a common practice was to bank the fire, pulling coals together and covering them with ash to slow burning and preserve heat. This lowered the chance of an active flame catching fabric, while keeping a core of warmth that could be revived in the morning. In towns, fire risk spread beyond one household. Buildings stood close, roofs could ignite quickly, and a single accident could move down a street. Some communities used night watchmen or local rules to reduce danger, especially in dense neighborhoods and during dry periods. The result is that medieval winter nights carried a quiet double awareness: the need for warmth and the need to control the very thing that produced it. This awareness shaped how people slept. They often arranged bedding so that it was close enough to benefit from the hearth's remaining warmth, but not so close that sparks and smoke made rest unsafe. In that balance, comfort against risk, you can hear the practical tone of many were another weak point because medieval buildings rarely sealed tightly. In modest homes, a window might be a small opening with wooden shutters. Some used oiled cloth, waxed cloth, or thin materials that admitted dim light but did not block cold well. In some places, scraped animal horn could be made translucent enough to serve as a panel. Glass existed, but it was expensive, often uneven, and did not always fit precisely in its frame. Cold air found gaps, so people improvised. Cracks could be stuffed with rags or straw. Cloth could be hung near doorways to cut drafts. Rolled fabric might be laid along thresholds. In harsher weather, openings could be blocked more fully, and households accepted lower light in exchange for less heat loss. These choices affected sleep directly. Drafts are easiest to feel when you stop moving, and the body cools faster at rest. That is why bed placement mattered. Away from exterior walls, away from direct airflow, and as protected as possible by whatever hangings or furniture existed. Winter insulation was not a product you bought. It was a set of small, repeated adjustments made to the same structure night after night until the home felt slightly less exposed to the weather. Understood space in terms of warm zones rather than a uniformly heated room. The area near the hearth was the center, and temperature dropped quickly as you moved away. Floors were a persistent problem. Bare earth and packed clay can feel damp and cold, while stone draws warmth away. Rushes and straw were often spread to reduce the chill underfoot and absorb dirt, though they required replacement and could attract pests if left too long. Wall hangings, even simple cloth, could soften drafts and reduce the cold radiating from masonry. In winter, beds were placed with intention because a few feet could matter. A bed near an outer wall might lose heat more rapidly. A bed tucked inward might feel less exposed. Some households created smaller sleeping pockets using curtains or hanging cloth around a bed or corner, not only for privacy but to reduce airflow. These are low-technology solutions, but they reflect a clear understanding. You do not need to heat all the air to keep a body warm. You need to reduce the pathways where heat escapes. The same idea shows up in layered bedding, tucked edges, and the simple act of sleeping closer together. These measures did not remove winter, but they made the night more manageable and made the return to sleep, after a brief waking or after tending the fire, humans and animals shared a roof, sometimes separated by a wall, sometimes by a partition, sometimes by nothing more than distance and routine. This arrangement was not only about convenience, it was partly about heat. A cow or a few sheep produce warmth continuously, and in deep winter that steady animal heat could raise the temperature of a building slightly. It also meant animals were safer from predators and harsh weather, and daily care was easier when snow or ice covered the ground. But the trade-offs were real. Smell, noise, insects, and increased difficulty maintaining cleanliness, especially when water was cold and drying was slow. Still, medieval households often accepted unpleasantness if it reduced risk. Even when livestock were not indoors, smaller animals sometimes contributed to winter nights in a different way. Dogs and cats could sleep near people, adding a small amount of warmth and serving as early warning systems for unfamiliar sounds. This is not sentimental. It is practical. Winter living brought many elements together under one roof: humans, tools, food stores, fuel, and sometimes animals, because the main goal was to concentrate resources and reduce exposure. That concentration shaped sleep. Less privacy, more shared sound, and a constant awareness that rest happened in the same space where survival outdoors could be dangerous, especially in winter. Darkness reduced visibility, roads could be icy or muddy, and landmarks disappeared. In towns, curfews were sometimes signaled by bells, and gates could close. Streets might be patrolled by watchmen, depending on city size and local organization. The risk was not only crime, it was also accident, illness, and exposure. A wrong turn in the dark could mean hours lost, and hours lost in winter could mean real harm. If movement was necessary, people carried light, torches, lanterns, small lamps protected from wind. But light also made a person visible, could attract assistance or attention. Because of these realities, many people avoided traveling at night unless they had a strong reason. This helps explain why evenings often became inward-focused. Once work was done and doors were secured, the household's world shrank to the interior. The remaining warmth, the stored supplies, and the shared effort of getting through the long season. That inward turn affected sleep as well. When the outside world is less accessible, more of life happens around the hearth, and bedtime becomes part of an organized routine rather than a flexible personal choice. Winter nights often ended the same way, with the door fastened, the room dim, and the household listening to weather before settling back into rest. Winter nights mattered. In long darkness, uncertainty feels louder. People worried about stored food, illness, rent, obligations, and whether storms would damage roofs or weaken animals. Many turned to religion for structure and comfort. Prayer before sleep or during a quiet waking could serve as routine as much as belief, a way to mark time, to steady attention, and to ask for protection when control was limited. Alongside formal faith, folk practices persisted. Protective symbols near doors, spoken blessings, charms sewn into clothing. These practices offered a sense of agency. Stories played a similar role. Winter evenings were often a season of telling. Local legends, moral tales, warnings about forests, strangers, and unseen dangers. These were not only entertainment. They were education, especially for children, and they shaped how the dark was imagined. This matters for sleep because the mind does not rest in a vacuum. The same room that held the hearth also held memory, belief, and fear. A small sound in the night could be interpreted through a whole library of shared stories. Yet the same shared culture could also make nights feel less lonely. Even when people woke briefly in the middle hours, they were waking into a world of familiar rituals and familiar meanings, not into silence varied by region, wealth, and period, but it generally followed practical concerns: warmth, cleanliness, and preserving clothing life. Some slept nude or nearly nude under heavy coverings, believing it kept bedding cleaner and reduced wear on garments. Others wore a linen shift or long shirt to absorb sweat and protect wool blankets from oils and soot. Head coverings remained useful in cold rooms, and foot warmth mattered more than people sometimes expect. Cold feet can disturb rest even today. In medieval winter, people used extra cloth wraps, sometimes warmed stones, or simply a careful sleeping position that reduced exposure. Hygiene was constrained. Washing was harder when water was cold and fuel was scarce. and drying was slow. Instead of frequent full bathing, winter cleanliness often relied on partial washing, hands, face, feet, and on routine maintenance. Combing hair, removing lice, airing bedding when weather allowed, and using herbs for scent or to discourage insects. These practices connect back to sleep because discomfort accumulates at night. Itching, damp fabric, and stale air can make rest lighter and more interrupted. Medieval winter routines aimed to reduce those irritations within limited means. The goal was not modern freshness. It was being dry enough, warm enough, and clean enough to sleep winter nights. It also helps to look earlier in the year, when households were preparing. By late autumn, many families shifted into a mindset of counting and repair. Roofs were checked before storms arrived. Walls were patched where wind could slip through. Door latches and hinges were repaired. Clothing was inspected and mended, because winter tore fabric quickly and replacing cloth was expensive. Fuel stores were built up. Food was preserved. Livestock decisions were made, which animals could be fed through winter and which could not. These decisions shaped both diet and labor. When the last harvest was stored, winter felt like a narrowing of options. The household's world became more dependent on what had already been gathered and what could still be obtained nearby. This seasonal preparation matters for sleep because it affects mental load. Rest is easier when stores feel secure and harder when supplies feel thin. The bed at night was not separate from the pantry, the woodpile, or the condition of the roof. Those inventories entered the mind when the room went quiet. Even without modern language for stress, people lived with a clear awareness. Winter is long, and mistakes are expensive. Night could feel calmer when preparation had been successful, and more tense when late autumn brought slaughter, not as spectacle but as winter logic. Fodder was limited, and keeping too many animals alive through the cold could mean starving both humans and livestock. Families kept breeding stock and work animals and culled the rest. The process was labor-intensive, often communal, and emotionally complicated when an animal had been part of daily life. Nothing was wasted if it could be used. Fat for cooking or candles, hides for leather, bones for tools or broth, and in some recipes, even blood as food. Preservation followed, salting, smoking, drying, methods designed to stretch protein into the months ahead. This affects the night in small ways. Winter meals tasted of preservation. Salt, smoke, sour fermentation. Cooking often required soaking and long simmering, which tied the household to the hearth for hours, especially in evening. A home that smelled of smoke-cured food could smell at the same time like security. But stored food also brought responsibility. Barrels could leak. Damp could ruin supplies. Rodents could find a corner. So winter comfort was never only about having stores. It was also about guarding them. And when the room went dark and bodies settled into bedding, those practical concerns did not vanish. They simply became quieter, waiting in the background, shaped winter eating across much of medieval Europe. Meat could be rubbed with salt or packed into brine, slowing decay by drawing moisture out and creating conditions where many bacteria struggle. But salt itself was not always cheap or easily available. Some regions had local saltworks. Others depended on trade and market control. When salt was scarce or costly, preservation options narrowed. Salted meat could last, but it changed in character. Dense, intensely salty, sometimes tough. Cooking often required soaking for hours or longer to soften it and reduce saltiness, which meant planning ahead. Winter food was rarely spontaneous. It was scheduled around what needed time to prepare and what fuel could support. This is one reason winter evenings often centered on the hearth. Simmering and softening were long processes, and the fire was already burning for warmth. Preserved food also shaped sleep in subtle ways. Heavy salty meals can increase thirst. Fermented or strong drink can lead to night waking for practical reasons. At the same time, a household that had successfully preserved food had a psychological advantage. The knowledge that provisions existed could make the night feel less uncertain. In a medieval winter, the bed and the pantry were linked. Hunger, thirst, and the sense of sufficiency all had the power to make sleep deeper. Were also common preservation methods, and they made kitchens into storage spaces as well as cooking spaces. Meat might hang above the hearth where smoke and gentle heat dried it slowly. In some areas, separate smokehouses existed, built to keep smoke circulating for long periods. Smoke compounds can discourage insects and slow spoilage. Drying creates a surface barrier by removing moisture. Fish in coastal regions was often preserved in similar ways, sometimes in strips dried hard and stored for later soaking and stewing. These methods influenced the sensory environment of winter homes. Smoke clung to hair, skin, and cloth. The smell could be comforting because it signaled food security, but it could also become stale and heavy when ventilation was limited. Winter cooking often began with rehydration. Soaking, simmering, softening. This suited the season's pace, but it also meant the hearth stayed active longer. That affects nighttime decisions about fire. A household might let coals remain after cooking to preserve heat, then bank them to last. The rhythm of the pot and the rhythm of sleep were not separate. The same fire that cooked the evening meal shaped how warm the bedding felt an hour later, and how easy it was to settle back into rest if someone woke. The true foundation of winter diet was not meat but grain. Wheat was more associated with wealth and status in many places, while rye, barley, and oats were common staples depending on region and climate. Grain became bread, porridge, and thick soups. It also became ale, which was both calories and a safer drink option in contexts where water quality could be uncertain, especially in towns. Storing grain safely was a constant challenge. Moisture could cause mold. Rodents could steal quietly. Storage strategies varied. Bins, barrels, raised platforms, sealed rooms, and cats were valued not only as companions but as practical workers. Bread itself reflected both status and practicality. Fine white bread signaled means. Darker loaves mixed from rye or barley were heavier and often more common. Some bread was baked dense enough to last several days and then used to thicken stews when it grew hard. Grain storage directly affected nighttime confidence. A full bin meant winter could be endured with less fear. A low bin made every day feel narrower. Sleep is sensitive to uncertainty. In medieval winter, that uncertainty was often measured in sacks and barrels. Ale and not similar fermented drinks were common in many communities. Small beer or low-alcohol ale provided hydration and calories, and brewing was often household labor. Mashing grain, boiling, fermenting, and flavoring. Hops were not universal in earlier periods. Some regions used herbal mixtures often called grut. In winter, warm drink could feel helpful. It added calories and a sense of comfort at the end of a cold day, but it also shaped nights in predictable ways. Drinking late could produce thirst later, or require waking to use a chamber pot, or leave a person restless. Medieval people did not describe this using modern sleep science, but they observed patterns and learned limits because a difficult morning in winter was more than annoyance. It could affect work, safety on ice, and the ability to keep a household running. This is one of the recurring themes of winter life. Small choices had amplified consequences. What you ate and drank at supper might not only affect comfort. It could change how the night unfolded, how often you woke, and how easily you returned to sleep. Winter routines encouraged moderation not as moralism, but because stability made the meal for many households was some form of thick stew, pottage, broth, porridge-like mixtures, built from whatever could be spared. One practical method was continuity. A pot simmered often, not necessarily the same stew unchanged for weeks, but a pattern of adding and stretching. More water, more grain, beans when available, a small piece of salted meat for flavor rather than quantity. This reduced waste and saved fuel, because one steady pot uses less intense fire than repeated cooking from scratch. It also matched winter behavior. Work moved indoors. Mending cloth, spinning fiber, repairing tools, carving wood, sharpening blades. These tasks could happen near the hearth while food cooked slowly. When night settled, the fire was banked, the pot moved or covered, and the household arranged, sleeping around what warmth remained. This domestic continuity created a slow, repetitive stability that suited long winter darkness. It also helps explain why waking at night could feel normal. The house was not designed for uninterrupted silence. Coals shifted, wood settled, animals moved. People lived with sound and adjusted to it, drifting back toward rest rather than treating every wake as winter time. Feast days marked the season with social gathering, better food if possible, and shared rituals that could lift morale. Fasting periods restricted meat and pushed diets toward fish, grain, and vegetables, changing what markets offered and what households prepared. For the wealthy, fasting could inspire elaborate substitutes. For the poor, rules might not transform meals as dramatically because meat was already limited. Religious practice also shaped nights. Prayer before sleep was common. Some households kept a small icon, cross, or devotional object near where people slept. In others, spoken prayer was the ritual. In the quiet hours, structured words could steady attention and reduce fear. This is not only a theological point, it is a behavioral one. When winter reduces control over weather, disease, and resources, ritual provides predictability. Predictability supports rest. It gives the mind a known sequence to follow when the room is dark and the outside world feels distant. Even when sleep was interrupted, people had familiar responses. A short prayer, a check of the fire, a return to bedding. Winter discipline, whether religious or practical, often aimed at the same outcome, making the long season survivable one night at a time. And sickness changed the experience of the night. Crowded rooms, smoky air, damp bedding, and limited sunlight created conditions where respiratory problems could spread. A mild cough could become dangerous. Fever could move through a household quickly. Without antibiotics, treatment was supportive. Warmth, rest, broths, herbs, and prayer. In some medical traditions, bloodletting might be used. The most vulnerable were infants and the elderly, and a cold night could push a fragile body into crisis. This shifts how we should imagine medieval sleep. Rest was not only comfort, it could be a form of medicine, and it could be interrupted by caregiving. Parents listened closely to a child's breathing in the dark. Someone might wake to adjust blankets, to offer water, to check a forehead for heat. In such circumstances, broken sleep was not a pattern chosen for convenience. It was simply the price of keeping someone alive. Even in healthier households, the presence of winter sickness in the community created awareness. A night of coughing heard through a wall or across a yard reminded people that winter danger was not only cold. It was also what cold did to bodies over time. It helps to follow a typical winter day and see how it leads naturally into night. Dawn arrived late and light was weak. People rose into cold air. If embers survived from the night, they were coaxed back to flame. If not, the day began with the labor of fire-making. Breakfast was often simple: bread, porridge, perhaps ale. Then came chores that could not wait. Feeding animals, hauling water, checking stored food, repairing damage from weather. Outdoor work continued in winter, but it shifted. Clearing paths, gathering fuel, tending animals, carrying supplies. Indoors, hands stayed busy with maintenance tasks that kept the household functional. As early darkness returned, the main meal was eaten. Then the household gathered close to the hearth. Conversation, quiet work by firelight, and preparation for morning. When the fire lowered and fuel and light were conserved, bedtime arrived. In this sense, winter sleep was not separate from winter labor. It was scheduled by daylight, cold, and the household's need to save had its own sound environment, and those sounds influenced how people interpreted waking. Wind interacted with buildings in a direct way, slipping under doors, pressing against shutters, and testing roof edges. In thatched cottages, gusts could make the roof rustle. In timber frames, beams could click as temperature changed. Snow altered sound by absorbing it. A village under snow could feel unusually quiet, as if wrapped in cloth. Rain felt different, more threatening, because it meant leaks, and leaks meant damp bedding, damp fuel, and increased illness risk. People learned weather by ear. The pitch of wind, the pattern of rain, the shift into sudden quiet. This attentiveness was practical. If you woke in the middle hours, you might listen before you moved, because movement meant leaving warmth. Listening was a low-cost way of gathering information. It also meant that winter nights were rarely experienced as pure emptiness. They were full of small signals. A household accustomed to those signals could settle more easily, recognizing what was normal, both essential and dangerous, and winter nights often included an underlying caution about it. Sparks could ignite textiles. Candles could tip, torches could drip resin. Even in homes with better fireplaces, shifting wood could throw embers outward. These risks shaped household rules, where people placed bedding, how close cloth could hang, how fires were reduced before long sleep. Towns sometimes treated fire as a public problem and organized watching or rules because dense construction allowed flames to spread quickly. But even without formal rules, winter behavior was often conservative. Many households accepted cooler rooms at night because an unattended strong fire was a serious threat. This does not mean they chose discomfort freely. It means they balanced risks based on experience. In a season when recovery from disaster was hard, preventing disaster mattered. When you combine this caution with other winter constraints, fuel supply, damp air, crowded space, you get a clearer picture of why sleep could be lighter, more segmented, and more responsive to the environment. Winter rest was designed to work inside a living, breathing house, not inside a setting could host unwanted life. Fleas and lice were common, and bedbugs existed too, thriving in cracks of wood frames and walls. especially where many bodies slept close together. Winter did not eliminate them. In some ways, winter supported them. People stayed indoors more, washed less often because heating water required fuel, and slept closer together under thicker layers. These conditions create both warmth and hiding places. People responded with what they had. Bedding could be aired on clear days, beaten to shake out dust and insects, or hung where smoke reached it. Certain herbs, wormwood is one often mentioned, were placed in bedding or around sleeping areas as a deterrent, sometimes for scent, sometimes for belief, and sometimes with real mild effect. Combing hair was not vanity. It was routine maintenance. Parents checked children, and household members checked one another. Night scratching could interrupt rest, and discomfort could make sleep lighter. This is a useful reminder that medieval sleep patterns were shaped not only by daylight and labor but also by physical irritants that were hard to fully control. In winter, when comfort already depended on careful layering and limited warmth, even small disturbances mattered more. Managing pests became part of what made the bed workable across winter was effortful rather than absent. Heating enough water for full bathing required fuel, and drying afterward in a cold room could be uncomfortable or risky for the sick. As a result, winter hygiene often focused on partial washing. Hands, face, and feet. These areas mattered for comfort and basic health, and they could be cleaned with smaller amounts of warmed water. Clothing maintenance mattered as well. Linen undergarments, when owned, helped absorb sweat and could be washed more easily than heavy wool. Outer garments were aired when weather allowed, and items were dried carefully near the fire, turned and watched to avoid sparks. In towns, bathhouses existed in many places, particularly in earlier centuries. They could be social spaces, but they also attracted moral suspicion at times and later fears about disease in some regions. For rural households, bathing was more often a tub near the hearth and careful timing so that hair and clothing had a chance to dry. These constraints connect directly to sleep. Damp fabric in bed is misery, and damp bedding can increase cold stress. So winter clean often meant simply dry enough to rest. People managed the body with the same mindset they applied to fuel and food. Conserve resources, avoid extremes, and keep conditions stable enough. Slower and riskier. Roads turned to mud, then froze into ruts. Rivers could swell or ice over unpredictably. Short daylight meant fewer safe hours to move, and weather could trap travelers far from home. Inns provided shelter, but comfort was not guaranteed. A traveler might find a smoky common room, simple food, and, surprising to modern expectations, shared sleeping. People could sleep in the same room, and sometimes even the same bed when space was limited. This was not automatically scandalous. It was pragmatic. Beds were scarce, and warmth was scarce. Inns aimed to keep guests alive and moving, but shared space increased caution. Money and valuables stayed close. Knives were not always far. Stories of thieves and tricksters circulated along the same roads as merchants. In that setting, sleep could be lighter, and waking in the middle hours could feel more alert, because you were listening not only for wind but for unfamiliar movement. This illustrates a broader point. Medieval winter sleep was strongly shaped by context. In a stable home, waking at night might be calm. In a crowded inn, the same waking night was organized more formally than in villages. Bells might mark time. Gates could close. Curfews sometimes required fires to be covered and streets to quiet. The goal was not romance. It was control and safety. Night watchmen could patrol, varying by city, era, and resources. Their presence changed the sound of darkness. Footsteps in streets, shouted calls, bells echoing off stone. Town sleep also had its own indoor character. Some people slept above workshops, surrounded by the smell of leather, dye, grain, or metalwork. Neighborhoods had patterns, bakers awake early, certain trades noisier at particular hours. Winter did not remove cold from towns, but towns offered one advantage: proximity. If illness struck, help could be closer. A neighbor might hear. Priest might be reached faster. So town nights balanced more noise and more strangers, with a stronger sense that you were not entirely alone against the season. For understanding sleep, this matters because it shows that quiet is not the only condition for rest. Predictable structure, bells, watch routines, household habits, could make noise less threatening, allowing people to settle even when the environment was treated as meaningful in medieval Europe. Especially vivid dreams, those remembered after deeper rest or near a waking interval, could be discussed as messages, warnings, or moral signs. Learned traditions included dream manuals and interpretations drawn from classical sources and Christian ideas. Ordinary people also used local readings. Dreaming of water, teeth, animals, fire, or travel might be taken as omen or advice. Whether we consider these interpretations accurate is less important than what they did socially. Dreams gave people language for uncertainty. They offered a way to talk about fear, guilt, hope, and illness in a culture with limited scientific explanation. In households where several people slept close together, a dream was not always private. A person might speak quietly about it or ask for a prayer. This could happen in the middle hours when someone was already awake and the room was calm. In that sense, dreams connected to sleep as a continuation of winter mental life rather than a separate realm. The same concerns that shaped daylight, health, food, safety, could return in dream form, then be absorbed back into routine through interpretation. Identical across Europe, and differences mattered for housing and sleep. In Mediterranean areas, deep snow was less common in many lowlands, but cold nights still arrived, and houses built for summer heat could feel surprisingly chilly in winter because thick walls held cold as well as coolness. Farther north and east, winters could be longer and darker, increasing fuel needs and making architectural choices more critical. Tighter construction, smaller openings, and in some regions the use of more efficient stoves in later periods. Bedding materials varied too. In some places, furs were more common. In others, wool dominated. Coastal diets shaped comfort as well, because preserved fish and seasonal availability affected hunger, and hunger affects rest. Even sleep timing could shift with latitude. The farther north you go, the more extreme winter darkness becomes, and the more total time the body may spend in bed, whether sleeping or resting quietly. So when we speak of medieval winter sleep, we are describing a family of adaptations. The common theme is not one universal schedule. It is responsiveness to darkness, temperature, and local class differences inside the same night. The wealthy could buy fuel, build chimneys, hang thicker textiles, commission curtains, and assign servants to keep fires alive. They could pre-warm beds, replace bedding, and retreat to more private chambers. The poor relied more on shared heat, constant repair, and improvisation. Patching cloth repeatedly, layering older garments, and concentrating everyone into one room. Yet wealth did not erase winter. Large stone buildings could be cold in ways small cottages were not, because wide spaces swallow heat and masonry holds cold. Wealth also carried its own pressures, hosting obligations, political travel, and public display even in harsh weather. What class changed most reliably was buffering. The wealthy had more ways to correct problems quickly. The poor had fewer margins for error. This matters for sleep because margins determine how the body experiences night. A household with extra blankets and reliable fuel can tolerate a colder evening without fear. A household without reserves may experience the same temperature as threat. In winter, sleep often reflects security more than the winter night can be described less as a straight line and more as a cycle. Evening meal, fire, quiet work, early rest, a calm interval in the middle hours, then later rest, then a gradual return of light. This cycle shaped expectations. Sleep was not always judged by perfection. It was judged by usefulness. Did it restore enough strength to continue? If someone woke in the middle hours, they did not automatically treat it as failure. They might adjust a blanket, check the latch, listen to weather, add a small piece of fuel if necessary, or whisper a short prayer, then settle again. This is one of the most practical lessons hidden in the history. Waking at night can be normal in long darkness, especially when the environment demands occasional attention. The medieval winter household lived close to its conditions. The room was not sealed from weather, and the bed was not separated from household management. Rest happened alongside responsibility. And yet, within that reality, people still slept enough often to winters became harsher or more unstable, especially toward the late medieval period and into the early modern era, in what historians often group under the term Little Ice Age. This does not mean constant blizzards everywhere. It suggests more frequent extremes. Longer freezes, wetter cold, late frosts, and summers that failed to ripen grain. A colder climate changes outcomes. Deep cold can kill livestock. Wet harvest seasons can rot stored grain. Late frosts can erase spring's promise. These shifts amplified every weakness in housing. Drafts, damp bedding, insufficient blankets, low fuel stores. Cold also changes sleep physiology. The body notices cold as danger, and rest becomes lighter when warmth is uncertain. Communities adapted socially as well. When travel became harder, people relied more on neighbors and local networks. This matters for winter nights because social stability can reduce risk. If help is possible, if a neighbor can share embers or a parish can offer aid, nights become less threatening. If help fails, cold becomes more than discomfort. It becomes slow damage. Rivers also reshaped winter landscapes. Frozen surfaces could become temporary roads, offering shortcuts that did not exist in summer, though ice was never fully trustworthy. People learned local water by experience, by loss, and by stories told afterward. In towns near rivers, a long freeze could become an event. Gatherings, vendors, curious crowds, depending on time and place. In rural areas, ice changed chores. Fetching water meant breaking a surface and carrying heavier buckets, risking numb hands. Laundry became a problem of timing. Wash when you can, dry when you dare. After sunset, frozen ground also altered sound. Footsteps on ice carry sharply, and in cold air, distant noises can seem closer. These environmental changes filter back into the bed. The more demanding the day becomes, more risk, more cold exposure, the more the body seeks rest. But the more unstable the environment feels, the more lightly the mind may sleep. Winter sleep sits between those forces, exhaustion pulling downward, and alertness keeping a small part of attention awake to weather and safety. It was also marked. Across medieval Europe, midwinter carried festivals shaped by local tradition and the Christian calendar. Even where religious meaning dominated, the seasonal instinct to bring light into the darkest weeks remained strong. Green branches, evergreens, holly, ivy, appeared in homes and churches because they signaled life that did not die back. Feasts mattered not only as celebration but as strategy. Communal meals redistributed food and morale, at least briefly, and reminded people that winter was shared rather than solitary. In some households, a holiday meal was planned for months, saving better meat, richer flour, a little honey, and occasionally a rare spice if anyone could afford it. Songs, processions, and services created structure in weeks that might otherwise feel like an endless stretch of cold. Even the poor often tried to mark the season in small ways. A treat, a shared drink, a story told with extra care. These practices relate to sleep because they regulate the mind. Winter can narrow attention to scarcity and worry. Rituals widen it again toward meaning and community. After a festival evening, people still went back to cold rooms and practical routines, but the emotional tone could shift. In long seasons, that shift matters. Sleep quality is shaped not only by temperature but by the stories people tell themselves about endurance, but it had a clear cost, and that cost shaped evening behavior. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and brighter and carried a pleasant scent, but beeswax was valuable and widely used in churches and wealthier settings. Tallow candles made from animal fat were cheaper and more common, but they could smoke, smell strong, and produce weaker light. In some places, people used rushlights, dried plant stalks dipped in fat, simple, brief, and practical when resources were limited. Oil lamps existed too, but oil supply depended on region and season. Light was not only about seeing. It determined how long certain tasks could continue. If candle supply was small, people planned around it. So quickly, read only if necessary, move carefully, then return to darkness. This is one reason evenings often felt shorter than the night itself. Staying awake meant consuming a resource that literally melted away. Light could be reserved for prayer, for sickness, for a birth, or for fear. Otherwise, people accepted dimness and adapted to it. For sleep, the effect is straightforward. Lower evening light supports earlier rest, and it reduces the sharp boundary between day mode and night mode. In winter, darkness was not a special mood. It was the normal condition for many. Also depended on social support, and that support varied widely. In towns, guilds sometimes helped members in hardship, providing assistance during illness, support for widows, or burial funds. Church parishes could distribute alms. Monasteries and convents sometimes offered bread, soup, or shelter, depending on local resources. Local elites might provide aid during extreme weather, sometimes from genuine concern and sometimes to preserve order. In villages, support could look simpler but no less important. Lending tools, sharing embers, trading labor, watching a neighbor's animals during illness. These small acts mattered when travel was hard and markets were unreliable. But winter also revealed fractures. When supplies ran low, generosity became difficult, and disputes over wood, food, or access could sharpen. This social dimension connects to sleep because it determines the level of background threat. A household that trusts its network can rest differently than one that feels isolated. Even if the room is equally cold, the sense of whether help exists changes the mind's readiness to relax. Winter nights, in many places, were not only personal experiences. They were community experiences, shaped by the strength or weakness of winter realities was simply running out of fuel. Cold is not evenly distributed. It concentrates where resources fail. If a household could not gather or buy enough wood, the hearth became a weak pulse rather than a steady center. People adapted. Living in one room, wearing more layers indoors, sleeping closer together, blocking cracks more aggressively, and changing cooking habits toward meals that required less active flame. But there is a point where adaptation becomes exhaustion. Chronic cold drains strength, worsens illness, slows healing, and makes injuries more dangerous. It also changes sleep. The body struggles to relax when it cannot maintain warmth, and rest becomes lighter and shorter. This is where winter becomes quiet tragedy, not necessarily through dramatic storms, but through the slow damage of weeks lived too cold. Understanding this helps prevent romanticizing the past. A warm bed was not only comfort, it could be protection in the same category as a roof or a locked door. When fuel was secure, the household could bank embers and sleep with more confidence. When fuel was insecure, the night carried a persistent calculation. How much warmth can we afford to spend? Hands did not. Winter pushed labor indoors. Spinning wool, weaving, sewing, repairing harness, carving wooden bowls, making pegs, sharpening blades, patching shoes. These tasks were not hobbies. They were maintenance work that kept a household functional until spring. Women's work often centered on textiles because clothing was expensive and winter damaged it quickly. Men often focused on tools, woodwork, and preparation for spring tasks, though roles varied by place and household. Children helped where they could, twisting fibers, fetching kindling, watching younger siblings. Firelight limited precision. People did what they could while visibility lasted and then saved both fuel and eyesight. This indoor industry affected sleep in a particular way. Bodies tired differently than in harvest season, less sun fatigue, more close air fatigue. Smoke and stale air could dull the head. Stillness could make aches more noticeable. At night, rest was not an escape from work so much as the next step in keeping the cycle going. Winter sleep supported winter productivity, and winter productivity supported the possibility of sleep. Because repairs and preparation reduced central heating, people created targeted warmth, small methods that mattered most at the feet and around the torso. A heated stone wrapped in cloth could warm feet for hours. A clay brick warmed near the hearth served a similar purpose. In wealthier homes, warming pans existed, effective but risky if used carelessly. Bed curtains and hangings were practical as well as decorative, reducing drafts and holding a pocket of warmer air close to the body. Nightcaps and head coverings helped because heat loss from the head is significant, especially in cold rooms. Socks or foot wraps mattered for the same reason. Sometimes the simplest method was position. Curling tightly, placing children between adults, tucking edges to reduce airflow, aligning bodies to block drafts. These are quiet technologies, no moving parts, no complex tools, but they reflect careful observation of how heat behaves. They also help explain why medieval beds could feel like engineered spaces rather than mere furniture. The room might remain cold, but the bed could become a smaller, more stable climate. That stability supports deeper rest, and it makes it easier to return to sleep after part of winter routine. Doors were barred with wooden beams. Latches were checked. In towns, locks became more common as trade increased and theft risk rose, though quality varied. Dogs were valuable not only for warmth but for warning. A dog's reaction to unfamiliar sound could alert a household faster than a bell. But houses themselves were noisy. Beams settled, shutters moved, thatch shifted, rodents traveled in walls. People learned these sounds over years and recognized what was normal. In winter, sound can travel differently, and the mind can misread it. A branch scraping may resemble footsteps. A distant call may seem closer in cold air. This affects sleep by encouraging a form of background listening. Even when people rested deeply, part of household life included awareness of the environment. That awareness did not always create fear. Often it created competence. Knowing the usual sounds of your own home is calming. It means you can dismiss most noises and save action for the rare sound that truly larger pattern. The medieval winter night looks like a repeated cycle of modest decisions. How much fuel to spend, how much light to use, how tightly to block drafts, where to place bodies and bedding, when to eat and what to drink, how to manage sickness when it appears. None of these decisions were dramatic on their own, but together they shaped what sleep felt like across a season. The most useful way to describe medieval winter sleep is not to treat it as either miserable or romantic. It was functional. It had interruptions, but those interruptions were often understood as part of ordinary life. The household adapted to long darkness the way it adapted to all winter constraints. By building routine, by conserving resources, and by accepting that perfection was not required. Rest needed to be sufficient, not flawless. That framing can change how we hear the past. It emphasizes resilience and practical intelligence. How people arranged materials and behaviors to make the night workable. So, even when comfort settled lower and the room grew quieter, medieval winter rest became a daily reset. After a day spent managing cold, the body sought warmth and stillness. The bed was a protected zone assembled from cloth, shared heat, and careful placement, while the house itself remained porous to weather. Outside, wind continued to test shutters and roofs. Inside, the household returned to routine. Tools put away, doors secured, embers banked, food stored, and bodies positioned to conserve warmth. The night could include a brief waking, but it did not always carry panic. Often it was simply the environment asking for a small correction. An extra layer pulled higher, a draft blocked, a child's blanket retucked, a quick check that the latch still held. Then stillness again. If we compare this to modern expectations of perfectly uninterrupted sleep, the difference is not that medieval people were less sensitive. It is that their rooms required occasional attention, and long winter darkness made quiet intervals of wakefulness feel normal. The central theme is adaptation. Sleep flexing to match the world around it, and returning when conditions were calm. Medieval winter sleep was rarely perfect, but it was rarely meaningless. It was a practical skill, shaped by fuel, architecture, clothing, and the simple fact that darkness lasted so long. The bed was not a private retreat in the modern sense. It was part of the household system for staying warm, staying safe, and staying well enough to begin again at dawn. And if someone woke briefly in the middle hours, it didn't always signal a problem. Often it was the night doing what winter nights do, asking for a small adjustment, a quiet check, and then allowing rest to return. If you're still awake and you'd like more calm, long-form history like this, you can tap like and subscribe. And if you want a next episode, leave a topic in the comments. Another century, another place, or one ordinary question from daily life. Good night.